This has to do with destructive cults and cults in general. Groups that engage in, what has been called undue influence, brainwashing, bounded choice. I mean, there's a number of terms that we could use for this. And, there's a lot of controversy, a lot of disagreements and whatnot about cults and destructive cults. And so I thought I might try to address some of this and, just share some of what I have learned over the last 3 years since I got out of Scientology and have been, learning about this subject, and share some of my thoughts and ideas about this in answering the questions that I've received here from this viewer. It sometimes can be considered a relatively controversial or hot topic, not just because, destructive cults ruin people's lives or there are some groups that are obviously destructive. They are just, people die being involved in them, right? You can think of David Koresh's Branch Davidians, that Waco situation, which was certainly not helped at all by the U.S. government and the ATF going in there. And then there's also groups that implode. I mean, there's Heaven's Gate. There's the Jim Jones situation back from the 70s. These are groups that just self-destructed, quite literally. And then there are groups who engage in outward destruction that are obviously destructive. Shrinikyo, I think I'm just butchering the pronunciation of that, but that Japanese cult a few years ago that tried to, and in fact did, launch sarin gas into the metro railway in Japan, and ended up trying to kill a great number of people. And some of the controversy comes in on this because some of these groups are referred to by some sociologists, religious scholars, and psychologists and whatnot. There's a certain group of these folks, academics mainly, who refer to these groups as new religious movements, and NRMs. And they've coined that term to try to take away the stigma of the word cult, because cult has such bad connotations and that sort of thing. And it does, admittedly. The word cult is not used as a compliment for a group. And of course, I've discussed the derivation of the word cult. It goes back to culture and cultivate, right? And back in the 1920s or so, started being used heavily derogatorily by Christians, in fact, toward groups that they thought were non-fundamentalists, had strayed from the path, or were satanic for some reason, and they were calling those groups cults. And so then we move forward, and now we have a more liberal society with more accepting values and trying to understand one another better. I think that's probably a good thing in many, many ways. But we can also throw the baby out with the bathwater there, in that we take all these groups and we say, well, they're just new religious movements. And they're not all so new, and they're not all so religious. And so there are a set of groups that are new religious movements, and they're not destructive cults. So if, in the Venn diagram of this, you have this, this large group of these new religious movements that have arisen, I guess we would say in the last 50 years or so. And within that group, you have some of those groups which would be called destructive cults. You could characterize them that way. And we'll go into how you characterize them that way in just a little bit. So not all new religious movements, not all religious groups, not all groups that have a leader and are centered around a common cause are cults, of course, right? So what is it that pushes it over the edge and makes it more cult-like? Well, it's a spectrum. It's not a black and white issue. As with anything, when you learn about critical thinking and logic and reason, you find out that there are very, very few things in this world that are just black and white. Not, very, very few. Most things are what you could refer to as what we used to call in Scientology. I hesitate to use this term. See me fumbling around right now but it is an apt term to use, which is a gradient scale. It's a scale, right? Or a spectrum is a more used modern term for this, right? So groups can be gauged on a spectrum of how closely they meet characteristics of a destructive cult. And these characteristics have been laid out in various ways and in various places ever since this subject was receiving serious academic study. And I think by that I'm going back to the 1950s and 60s. This is just the information that I'm familiar with personally. There may be earlier works on this as well. Not all cults or destructive cults are religious in nature. That often gets missed. There are many, many, many destructive cults out there that have nothing to do with religion. There are destructive cults that are martial arts cults, political cults, social issue cults. Any group of people centered around a leader or leaders can become a destructive cult or can be founded as a destructive cult if these characteristics are in place. And religious thought or belief is not one of the characteristics. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because I think that these characteristics, when applied only to religious groups, you will miss. And you'll have this idea that that it's only in the religious sphere, right? But politics, there's a number of groups that center around political movements that have nothing to do with religion. They have to do with how the country should be run, and yet those groups can focus too closely, too narrowly on the leader, what the leader says, how the leader dictates what the followers have to do with their time and energy and money. And then you have a group there within the larger political, of all the groups that exist, all the political action committees and political parties and committees and all of these things that exist. You have again the Venn diagram of all these groups, and then you have a subset within that group that could be meet the definition of destructive cults, and they're political in nature. Okay, you could also have the same thing applies with social groups. You have it's impossible to bring up any social group without pissing off somebody. And, some of you guys, just hitting the unsubscribe button just because I say the word. So I'm hesitant to even go into what social groups could involve cults. But they're there, okay? They exist. And if you look at the characteristics of a destructive cult against any group or subgroup, it pretty quickly becomes apparent what kind of groups meet these definitions or move on the spectrum towards those characteristics.